Welcome, dear listener, to a place where shadows gather beneath ancient boughs, and the wind carries more than just the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Close your eyes now, let your breathing slow, and allow yourself to drift into the depths of a forgotten woodland, where time moves differently, and the trees hold memories older than civilization itself. Tonight, we venture into a forest that maps refuse to record, a place where the canopy grows so thick that even moonlight struggles to reach the forest floor. Here, beneath towering pines that have stood sentinel for centuries, something waits in the spaces between silence. Can you hear it? That gentle rustling, not quite wind, not quite whisper, the soft creak of ancient bark, the distant snap of twigs beneath unseen feet, and threaded through it all, the faintest echo of something that might once have been a song. This is a place where lost souls have wandered for generations, drawn by a melody that drifts through the undergrowth like morning mist, a lullaby as old as the forest itself, beautiful in its simplicity, terrible in its purpose. Those who hear it speak of peace beyond measure, though few who venture deep enough to truly listen ever return to tell their tale. So settle in, let your mind wander into these shadowed groves, and prepare yourself for a journey into the heart of the woodland's darkest secret. For tonight, you too will hear the lullaby beneath the pines, in the space between waking and sleeping, where thoughts drift like autumn leaves on still water. There exists a forest that remembers what the world has forgotten. It stands beyond the reach of modern maps, nestled in the fold of mountains that cast shadows longer than memory itself. The locals in the valley below speak of it only in whispers, crossing themselves when the wind carries its scent of moss and ancient wood down to their doorsteps. Dr. Alina Marsh had come to this place not by choice, but by the gentle insistence of circumstance. The university had granted her sabbatical after the incident, though they called it a research opportunity, a chance to study the folklore of isolated communities. She knew better. They wanted her gone, wanted time for the whispers about her mental state to fade like morning mist. The cottage she had rented sat at the forest's edge, its windows facing the tree line like curious eyes, built of local stone and weathered timber. It seemed to have grown from the earth itself, as natural and inevitable as the trees that surrounded it. The elderly woman who had rented it to her, Mrs. Blackwood, with her silver hair and knowing smile, had left only one instruction: don't venture into the woods after sunset, dear. The forest has its own rules. Alina had smiled politely and nodded, filing the warning away with the dozens of other superstitions she had encountered in her research. She was a rational woman, a professor of ethnomusicology who had spent her career documenting the musical traditions of forgotten cultures. She understood how isolation bred folklore, how the human mind created stories to fill the spaces where knowledge ended. But on her first night in the cottage, as she sat by the window with her tea growing cold in her hands, she began to understand that some warnings came not from superstition, but from a deeper wisdom. The forest at night was not the same forest that existed in daylight, as darkness settled over the valley like a blanket pulled up to the chin of the world. The tree lines seemed to shift and breathe. The boundary between shadow and substance became fluid, uncertain, and from somewhere deep within those shifting depths came a sound that made her breath catch in her throat. It was barely audible at first, a whisper of melody that might have been the wind moving through the branches, might have been the settling of old wood, might have been nothing at all. But Elena's trained ear caught the structure beneath the apparent randomness, the deliberate pattern that spoke of human intention. Someone, somewhere in that dark expanse, was humming a lullaby. She set down her teacup with trembling fingers, pressing her ear closer to the glass. The melody drifted closer, then farther, as if carried by an invisible singer who wandered the forest paths. It was hauntingly beautiful, built on a scale she didn't recognize, with intervals that seemed to twist back on themselves like a musical Mobius strip. The tune pulled at something deep in her chest, awakening a longing she couldn't name. Sleep now, my darling, sleep now, my dear, the forest is singing. The forest is near, close weary eyes to the world's cruel light, and dream in the arms of eternal night. The words came to her unbidden, as if she had always known them, as if they had been waiting in some unused corner of her mind for this moment to emerge. Her lips moved silently, forming syllables that felt both foreign and familiar on her tongue. The melody wrapped around her thoughts like silk thread, drawing them into patterns she didn't recognize. When she finally pulled herself away from the window, hours had passed. The cottage had grown cold around her, and her tea sat forgotten, skin of ice forming on its surface. She stumbled to bed in a daze, her mind still echoing with that impossible melody, and fell into dreams that tasted of moss and moonlight. In the morning, she woke with the song still playing in her head and ink stains on her fingers. Beside her bed lay a sheet of manuscript paper covered in her own handwriting notation. She had no memory of capturing a melody that seemed to shift and change even as she looked at it. The notes swam before her eyes like living things, rearranging themselves into new patterns, new possibilities. She told herself it was nothing more than a curious bit of sleepwalking, a remnant of the stress that had brought her to this place. But as she prepared her breakfast and tried to focus on the mundane tasks of morning, the melody continued to play in the background of her thoughts, a constant gentle insistence that something in the forest was calling to her. Chapter 2. The music in the shadows. The days that followed settled into a rhythm as regular as breathing. Elena would wake before dawn, make her coffee, and sit at the kitchen table to work on her research, cataloging the folk songs of the region, analyzing their structures and origins. But always, beneath the academic work, she found herself returning to the mysterious notation she had written in her sleep, trying to decode its meaning. The melody haunted her in the way that certain songs do, playing itself endlessly in the quiet spaces of her mind. She would find herself humming it while she worked, while she cooked, while she stared out the window at the forest that seemed to watch her in return. Each repetition revealed new layers, new subtle variations that she was certain hadn't been there before. The locals in the village below were kind, but distant when she made her weekly trips for supplies. They would smile and nod, offer polite conversation about the weather and the harvest. But their eyes would grow guarded when she mentioned the forest. When she asked about the old songs their grandparents might have sung, Mrs. Henderson at the general store would change the subject with practiced ease. Young Father Thomas at the church would find sudden urgent business whenever she approached with her notebook and recording equipment. It was old Mr. Thorne, the village librarian, who finally broke the silence. She had been sitting in the small reading room above his shop, poring over local histories and genealogical records, when he approached her table with a cup of tea and an expression of reluctant concern. "You're asking about the forest songs," he said, settling into the chair across from her with the careful movements of age. His voice was barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might summon unwanted attention. Elena looked up from her notebooks, trying to keep her expression casual. "I'm documenting the musical traditions of the area. Any old songs, lullabies, work songs, they're all valuable for preservation." Mr. Thorne's weathered hands wrapped around his teacup, and she noticed the way his knuckles whitened with the force of his grip. "Some songs are best left undisturbed, Dr. Marsh. Some traditions exist for good reason. Surely you don't believe. I believe in what I've seen." His interruption was gentle but firm. "My grandmother used to tell stories about the Whispering Grove, about the singers who walked among the trees. She said there was a time when the forest was different, when it welcomed visitors and shared its secrets freely. But something changed, long ago, something that made the trees themselves weep." Elena leaned forward, her academic interest warring with a growing sense of unease. "What kind of change?" The old man was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on something beyond the window, beyond the present moment. When he spoke again, His voice carried the weight of inherited sorrow. There was a family that lived deep in the forest, in the days when such things were possible. The harrowing family musicians, all of them, blessed with voices that could charm birds from the sky and coax flowers to bloom out of season. They made their living traveling from village to village, sharing their gift with any who would listen. He paused to sip his tea, and Alina found herself holding her breath. But the youngest daughter, Melody, yes, that was truly her name, she was different from the rest. Her voice was beautiful beyond measure, so pure and sweet that those who heard it spoke of feeling as though they had glimpsed heaven itself. But there was something else in her music, something that went deeper than mere beauty. When Melody sang, the very fabric of the world seemed to bend around her voice. Outside, clouds had gathered while he spoke, casting the small room in gray twilight. Mr. Thorne's voice took on the cadence of an old story, worn smooth by countless tellings. The trouble began when the family decided to settle permanently in the forest. They built a house among the ancient trees, where the acoustics were perfect and Melody's voice could reach its full potential. But as the seasons passed, her music began to change. It grew more complex, more layered, as if she were learning harmonies from the wind itself, rhythms from the heartbeat of the earth. Elena's pen moved across her notebook almost without her conscious direction, capturing every word. But even as she wrote, she felt a chill creeping up her spine, a recognition that scratched at the edges of her mind. The villagers started to notice that children who heard Melody sing would disappear for days at a time, found wandering the forest with no memory of where they had been, humming melodies no one recognized. Adults who ventured too close to the harrowing house would return changed, speaking of visions and dreams that felt more real than waking life. Mr. Thorne's teacup rattled against its saucer as he set it down, and Alina realized his hands were shaking. In the end, it was Melody's own family who had to act. They could see what their daughter was becoming, what her gift was doing to the world around her. On the night of the winter solstice, they performed a song so powerful it would trap Melody's voice within the forest forever, ensuring that her music could never again reach the outside world. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Alina found herself thinking of the melody she had been humming, the notation that had appeared beside her bed like a message from the unconscious mind. What happened to her? She asked, though part of her already knew she didn't want to hear the answer. Some say she died that night, that the binding was meant to silence her forever. Others believe she still walks among the trees, singing her endless lullabies to an audience of shadows and moonbeams. Mr. Thorne stood slowly, gathering his empty cup, but all agree on one thing: those who hear her song are forever changed by it. The forest calls to them, draws them deeper with each passing night, until they become part of the music themselves. He paused at the door, turning back to meet her eyes with an expression of profound sadness. Your window faces the forest, doesn't it, Dr. Marsh? You've been sleeping poorly since you arrived. I can see it in your eyes, that distant look of someone who has heard something they can't forget. Alina wanted to deny it, wanted to laugh off his concerns as the rambling of an old man steeped in local superstition. But the words died in her throat as she recognized the truth in what he said. She had been sleeping poorly, waking each morning with melodies on her lips and ink on her fingers. Dreams that felt more vivid than reality. Be careful, Mr. Thorne said softly. The forest has a long memory, and some hungers are never satisfied. Chapter 3. The Weight of Melodies that night. Alina found herself unable to concentrate on anything but the story Mr. Thorne had told her. She had returned to the cottage with her mind buzzing with questions, her notebook filled with fragments of folklore that seemed to dance at the edge of comprehension. The rational part of her mind, the part trained in academic rigor, insisted that she was simply encountering a particularly rich vein of local mythology. Every culture had its cautionary tales about the dangers of the wilderness, its stories of supernatural forces that punished those who ventured too far from the safety of civilization. But as darkness fell and the familiar melody began its nightly performance somewhere in the depths of the trees, Alina found her rational mind growing quieter, overwhelmed by something deeper and more primal. The song seemed stronger tonight, clearer, as if the act of learning its history had somehow opened a door in her perception. She could hear layers in the music that had been hidden before, harmonies that seemed to come from multiple sources, counter-melodies that wove through the main theme like golden thread through dark fabric. She stood at her window, pressing her palms against the cool glass, and allowed herself to really listen for the first time. The melody wasn't random or improvised, she realized. It was structured, composed, with themes and variations that spoke of sophisticated musical intelligence. More than that, it seemed to be responding to her attention, growing more complex and elaborate as she focused on its patterns. Sleep now, my darling. Sleep now, my dear. The forest is singing. The forest is near. Step from your window, step from your door, and wander where no one has wandered before. The words came again, but this time they were different, evolved. Where before there had been passive invitation, now there was gentle urging. Alina found herself reaching for the window latch, her fingers tracing the cold metal as if of their own accord. The logical part of her mind screamed warnings, but they seemed to come from very far away, muffled by the overwhelming beauty of the music that filled her thoughts. She managed to pull her hand back, to step away from the window with an effort that left her trembling. But even as she moved to the kitchen to make tea, to ground herself in ordinary tasks, the melody followed her. It seemed to emanate from the walls themselves now, from the very air she breathed. Each note resonated in her chest, in her bones, creating sympathetic vibrations that made her feel as though she were becoming an instrument played by invisible hands. The kettle's whistle, when it came, was almost a relief, a sharp, mechanical sound that cut through the supernatural music like a knife. Alina poured her tea with shaking hands, wrapping her fingers around the warm ceramic and using its heat to anchor herself in physical reality. But even as she sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by the familiar objects of her temporary life, she could feel the forest's attention like a weight on her shoulders. She forced herself to focus on her work, spreading out the notes and recordings she had gathered during her time in the village. There had to be a rational explanation for what she was experiencing. Perhaps the forest's unique acoustics were creating some kind of auditory illusion. Perhaps the stress of her situation, combined with the isolation and unfamiliar environment, was causing her to hallucinate. There were documented cases of perfectly sane people experiencing auditory phantoms under similar circumstances. But as she reviewed her notes from Mr. Thorne's story, Alina found herself drawing connections that made her academic training seem suddenly inadequate. The description of Melody's voice bending reality around itself reminded her of certain theoretical frameworks in ethnomusicology, ideas about music as a fundamental force of creation, about sound as the building blocks of existence itself. In many cultures, creation myths began with song, with divine voices singing the world into being. What if? Alina found herself thinking, those myths contained more literal truth than modern scholarship assumed. What if there were indeed voices, capable of reshaping reality through pure sound? And what if one of those voices had been trapped in this forest, growing stronger and more desperate with each passing year? The thought should have seemed absurd, the kind of speculation that would earn her concerned looks from her colleagues. But sitting in her small kitchen, with the supernatural melody weaving itself through her thoughts like a living thing, it felt not only possible, but inevitable. She opened her laptop and began to type, documenting her experiences with the same meticulous care she brought to her academic research. If she was losing her mind, she had to consider that possibility then. At least she would leave a record of the process. But if something genuinely supernatural was occurring, then her documentation might serve as a warning for future researchers. The hours passed without her noticing. Outside, the forest sang its ancient song, and inside, Alina wrote, with a fever that felt almost like inspiration. She described the melody's structure, its variations, its apparent responsiveness to her attention. She transcribed the lyrics that seemed to flow into her mind unbidden, noting their evolution from night to night. She analyzed the mathematical relationships between the notes, the way certain intervals seemed to create resonances that went beyond mere acoustic phenomena. When she finally looked up from her laptop, dawn was breaking through her windows, and her notebook lay beside her, filled with pages of musical notation in her own handwriting. But this time, she remembered writing it. This time, she had been conscious as the melody revealed itself to her, showing her its deeper structures, its hidden complexities. The notation was unlike anything she had seen before. It incorporated elements from multiple musical traditions, the modal structures of ancient European folk songs, the microtonal intervals of Middle Eastern music, the rhythmic complexities of African polyrhythms. But more than that, there were notational symbols she didn't recognize, markings that seemed to indicate dimensions of sound beyond pitch and rhythm. Looking at them made her head ache, as if her mind were trying to process information it wasn't equipped to understand. Alina rubbed her tired eyes and glanced toward the window. The forest stood silent in the morning light, its trees ordinary and unremarkable. But she knew that come nightfall, the singing would begin again, and with each repetition, the melody would grow stronger, more insistent, more difficult to resist. She was beginning to understand that she was not merely documenting a phenomenon, she was becoming part of it. The forest was not just singing to her, it was singing through her, using her musical training and academic expertise to decode and preserve its ancient song. But to what end? And what would happen when the process was complete? As she closed her laptop and prepared for another day of research in the village, Alina couldn't shake the feeling that she was running out of time to find answers. The melody was growing stronger each night, and with it, her desire to step out of the cottage, to walk among the trees, and find the source of the music that haunted her dreams. Soon, she feared, desire would become compulsion, and compulsion would become fate. Chapter 4. The Deepening Song *. Dr. Marsh's days in the village had taken on a desperate quality that did not go unnoticed by the locals. Where before she had approached her research with the measured curiosity of an academic, now she questioned everyone with an intensity that made them uncomfortable. She could see the way conversations died when she entered the general store, the way eyes avoided hers when she passed on the narrow streets. But she couldn't stop herself. Each night brought new verses to the song, new layers of melody that seemed to unlock memories she had never lived. She would wake each morning with her throat hoarse, as if she had been singing for hours, though she had no recollection of making any sound. The notation beside her bed grew more complex, more alien, filled with symbols that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. It was Mrs. Blackwood who finally provided the breakthrough Alina both craved and dreaded. The elderly landlady appeared at her cottage door on a gray Thursday morning, carrying a wicker basket and wearing an expression of resigned sadness. "May I come in, dear?" she asked, and though her voice was gentle, Alina heard something in it that brooked no refusal. They sat in the cottage's small parlor, Mrs. Blackwood's weathered hands busy with knitting, while Alina fidgeted with her ever-present notebook. The older woman worked in silence for several minutes, her needles clicking in a rhythm that seemed almost musical, before she finally spoke. "You've been asking questions in the village," she said, without looking up from her work, "about the old songs, about the forest. People are worried about you." Alina felt a flush of defensiveness rise in her chest. "I'm a researcher. Asking questions is what I do, indeed." Mrs. Blackwood's needles paused. "But there are some questions that are dangerous to ask, and some answers that are dangerous to hear. You've been hearing things at night, haven't you? Songs that feel older than memory itself." The directness of the question caught Alina off guard. She had expected more careful dancing around the subject, more euphemisms and half-spoken warnings. How did you? Because I heard them too, once upon a time. Mrs. Blackwood set down her knitting and fixed Alina with eyes that were suddenly sharp and knowing. 60 years ago, when I was young and foolish and thought I could solve the world's mysteries through sheer force of will, I rented this very cottage, just as you have, and I sat at that very window, listening to the forest sing. Elena's notebook slipped from her fingers, forgotten. You're a researcher. I was studying acoustical phenomena for my doctoral thesis, natural sound chambers, the way certain geographical formations could amplify and distort audio signals. I thought the reports of supernatural music in this forest were simply the result of unique topographical conditions. Mrs. Blackwood smiled sadly. I was wrong, of course. Some things in this world cannot be explained by science, no matter how desperately we wish they could be. But you left, Alina said, though even as she spoke the words, she wondered if she still could. You walked away from your research. I left because I had to, and because I was given a choice that you may not be. Mrs. Blackwood reached into her wicker basket and withdrew a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age. I've been watching you, dear. I've seen the way you stand at your window each night, the way you write in your sleep. You're further along than I ever was. The song has found a much more receptive instrument in you than it did in me. Alina took the journal with trembling fingers. The leather was soft with age, and when she opened it, she found pages covered with musical notation in a handwriting that was almost, but not quite, the same as what appeared beside her bed each morning. The melodies were similar to what she had been transcribing, but simpler, less developed, as if this journal represented an earlier stage of the same process she was now experiencing. I could only hear fragments, Mrs. Blackwood explained, bits and pieces of the greater song, but you have the training, the natural ability to hear it all. That's why it chose you, why it called you here, called me. Alina looked up from the journal. I came here because you had a breakdown at the university, because you started hearing music that no one else could hear, music that made your students uncomfortable and your colleagues question your sanity. Mrs. Blackwood's voice was gentle but implacable. It wasn't a breakdown, dear. It was a summoning. The words hit Alina like a physical blow. She had tried so hard to rationalize what had happened at the university, to convince herself that stress and overwork had caused her to hallucinate during her lectures. But Mrs. Blackwood was right. The music she had heard in those final weeks had been beautiful, complex, and utterly real to her. It had been the beginning of this same song, reaching out across impossible distances to find someone who could truly hear it. Melody harrowing, Alina whispered, the name feeling heavy on her tongue, is still singing, yes. Still trapped in the forest, still looking for someone who can complete her work. Mrs. Blackwood's knitting needles resumed their quiet clicking. The question now is, what you intend to do about it. Alina turned the pages of the old journal, seeing in the simpler notations the seeds of the complex harmonies that now filled her nights. Mr. Thorne said she was bound by her family, trapped in the forest to prevent her music from reaching the outside world. That's one version of the story. Mrs. Blackwood's voice carried the weight of deeper knowledge. But there are others. Some say she wasn't trapped at all, but transformed, that she chose to merge her consciousness with the forest itself, to become a living embodiment of the music she loved so much. And some say she's not finished with her great work, that she's been waiting all these years for someone with the skill to help her complete it. Complete what? Mrs. Blackwood was quiet for a long moment, her needles stilled. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. The song of unmaking. The melody that can dissolve the boundaries between dream and reality, between consciousness and the vast unconscious that underlies all existence. Melody was always gifted, but in her final years, she began to believe that music could be used to break down the artificial barriers that separate us from the deeper truths of existence. She wanted to create a song that would allow consciousness to flow freely between all living things. To establish a kind of universal harmony, Alina felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cottage's drafty windows. "And you think she's using me to finish this work? I think she's been trying to finish it for 150 years, and you're the first person she's encountered with both the musical training and the natural sensitivity to hear what she's truly singing." Mrs. Blackwood reached out and gently closed the journal in Alina's hands. "The question is whether you'll let her." Alina stared down at the worn leather, feeling the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her shoulders. Part of her, the rational, academic part, wanted to pack her bags and leave immediately, to return to the safety of the known world before she lost herself entirely to this supernatural influence. But another part, a part that seemed to grow stronger each night, whispered that leaving was no longer an option. The song had found her, had chosen her, had spent months preparing her for this moment, and despite the fear that made her hands shake and her breath come short, she felt a terrible curiosity about what would happen if she stayed, if she allowed the process to reach its completion. "What did you do?" she asked, "when you realized what was happening?" Mrs. Blackwood smiled sadly and resumed her knitting. "I ran, dear. I packed my things in the middle of the night and drove away as fast as I could. And I've spent the last 60 years wondering what might have happened if I had been braver." She paused, her needles clicking in their gentle rhythm. "But you're not going to run, are you?" Alina looked toward the window, where afternoon shadows were already beginning to lengthen toward evening. Somewhere in the forest, she knew, an ancient voice was preparing for another night of song, another opportunity to share its burden with someone who could truly understand. "No," she said softly, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. "I don't think I am." Chapter 5. The calling deep as night settled over the forest like a familiar embrace. Alina found herself preparing for what she somehow knew would be a turning point. She had spent the afternoon reading through Mrs. Blackwood's journal, tracing the development of the mysterious song through pages of increasingly frantic notation. The older woman had documented the same progression. Alina was experiencing the nightly appearances of transcribed music, the growing complexity of the melodies, the way the forest seemed to pulse with intentional rhythm after dark. But Mrs. Blackwood's journal ended abruptly, mid-sentence, with a final entry that sent chills down Alina's spine. "I can feel her calling to me, begging me to come deeper into the trees. The music is so beautiful now, so complete, that staying in the cottage feels like torture. I understand now why the children disappeared for days at a time. The world outside the forest has become gray and lifeless by comparison. Tonight, I think I will go to her. Tonight, I will learn what she has been trying to teach me." The next page was blank, and the rest of the journal was empty. Alina closed the book and set it aside, her hands trembling slightly. Mrs. Blackwood had escaped somehow, had found the strength to resist the forest's call and build a life in the ordinary world. But the cost of that resistance was written in the lines of her face, in the sadness that seemed to follow her like a shadow. She had spent 60 years wondering what she might have discovered if she had been brave enough to take that final step into the unknown. As darkness deepened outside her windows, Alina felt the familiar stirring that announced the beginning of the nightly performance. But tonight was different. Tonight, the music seemed to come from much closer than before, as if the invisible singer had moved from the deep forest to the very edge of her garden. The melody was clearer, more immediate, and with it came a sense of presence so strong that Alina found herself looking toward the door, half expecting someone to knock. "Come now, my darling. Come now, my dear. The time for waiting has ended here. Step from your safety, step from your light, and join in the dance of eternal night." The words seemed to bypass her ears entirely, appearing directly in her consciousness with the clarity of her own thoughts. Alina stood slowly, her notebook and pen falling forgotten to the floor. The rational part of her mind, the part that had served her so well throughout her academic career, was screaming warnings, reminding her of all the cautionary tales about people who disappeared into forests and were never seen again. But that voice was growing weaker each night, overwhelmed by something deeper and more primal. The music wasn't just beautiful anymore, it was necessary. It filled spaces in her soul she hadn't known were empty, answered questions she hadn't known she was asking. The world outside the forest's influence seemed increasingly hollow, a pale imitation of the rich reality that waited among the trees. Alina moved to the window and placed her palm against the glass. The forest stretched before her in the moonlight, its trees swaying gently in a wind she couldn't feel from inside the cottage. But as she watched, she began to notice that the movement of the branches wasn't random. They swayed in rhythm, keeping time with the music that filled her thoughts. The entire forest was dancing to the same mysterious melody, participating in a performance that had been going on for more than a century. And at the heart of that performance, barely visible in the shifting shadows between the trees, Alina caught glimpses of movement that was almost human. A figure in white, translucent as moonlight, moving among the trunks with the fluid grace of someone for whom the forest held no obstacles. As Alina watched, the figure turned toward the cottage, and for a moment, that seemed to stretch into eternity. Their eyes met across the impossible distance. The face was young, beautiful, with dark hair that seemed to flow like water in an unfelt breeze. But the eyes held the weight of centuries. The accumulated loneliness of someone who had been singing the same song for far too long without an audience capable of truly understanding. In those eyes, Alina saw not madness but a terrible, brilliant sanity, a perspective that encompassed truths too vast for ordinary human comprehension. "Help me," the figure seemed to say, though no words crossed the space between them. "Help me finish what I started. Help me break down the walls that keep consciousness trapped in these small, separate cages." Alina's hand found the window latch, as if guided by some external force. The metal was cold against her fingers, but she barely noticed. All her attention was focused on the figure in the forest, on the overwhelming sense of recognition that flooded through her as she stared into those ancient, lonely eyes. This was Melody Harrowing, she realized. Not dead, not exactly alive, but transformed into something that existed in the liminal space between states of being. The binding her family had performed hadn't destroyed her. It had made her into a living song, a consciousness woven from pure music that could no longer interact with the physical world in conventional ways. But Alina could change that. With her training, her sensitivity, her willingness to listen, she could provide the bridge Melody needed to complete her work. She could help weave the song of unmaking that would dissolve the barriers between minds, that would allow consciousness to flow freely across the artificial boundaries that kept all living things isolated from one another. The window latch turned easily under her touch, and the cool night air flowed into the cottage like a river of possibilities. The music grew stronger, more complex, layering harmonies upon harmonies, until Alina felt as though she were standing in the middle of a vast orchestra. But every instrument was a voice, and every voice was singing the same impossible song that promised to remake the world. Alina stepped onto the cottage's small porch, her bare feet finding the wooden boards without conscious direction. The night air was cool against her skin, carrying scents of moss and deep earth and growing things. But more than that, it carried music, not just the melody she had been hearing for weeks, but the deeper harmonic structures that supported it, the rhythmic foundations that gave it weight and meaning. The figure in the forest raised one translucent hand, beckoning, and though every instinct Alina had developed over 35 years of careful, academic living screamed at her to go back inside. To lock the door and wait for morning, she found herself walking forward. The grass was soft beneath her feet, damp with dew that sparkled like scattered diamonds in the moonlight. Each step took her closer to the tree line, closer to the boundary between the ordinary world and whatever strange reality existed within the forest's embrace. The music grew stronger with every footfall, more layered, more complex, until Alina felt as though she were walking through solid sound, through melodies made manifest in the physical world. At the edge of the forest she paused. The trees loomed above her like ancient cathedral columns, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the moonlight. Beyond the first line of trunks, shadows moved with purpose and intent, and she could see pathways that seemed to shift and change even as she watched them. Melody harrowing stood just inside the tree line, no longer translucent but solid, real, immediate. Up close, Alina could see that her white dress was actually woven from mist and moonlight, that her dark hair moved to rhythms only she could hear, but her eyes were completely human, filled with a desperate hope that made Elena's heart ache. "You heard me," Melody said, and her voice was the same melody that had haunted Elena's nights, transformed into words that carried the weight of musical truth. "You really heard me." "I heard you," Elena confirmed, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "I've been hearing you for weeks. Melody laughed, and the sound was like silver bells chiming in perfect harmony. "I've been calling for decades, for centuries. So many came to the cottage, so many listened to fragments of the song, but none of them had the training to hear what I was really singing. None of them understood the work I'm trying to complete." Alina looked deeper into the forest, where she could now see lights moving among the trees, not electric lights, but something that glowed with its own inner radiance. The song of unmaking. "You want to dissolve the boundaries between consciousness. I want to free us all from the prison of individual existence," Melody corrected, her eyes blazing with fervent intensity. "Do you know what it's like to be trapped inside your own mind? To experience the world only through the narrow window of a single perspective? We are all islands of consciousness in an ocean of possibility, and the barriers between us are artificial, unnecessary." She gestured toward the forest, where Alina could now see other figures moving among the trees, translucent shapes that might once have been human, all of them swaying to the same unheard rhythm. "These are the ones who heard fragments of my song over the years," Melody continued, her voice carrying notes of both triumph and sorrow. "Children who wandered too deep into the woods, adults who listened too closely to melodies they couldn't quite understand. They didn't have the knowledge to help me complete the work, but they heard enough to begin the transformation. Now they exist between states, waiting for the moment when the final barriers can be dissolved." Alina felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "You're collecting people, building an audience for your song." "I'm gathering instruments," Melody corrected, stepping closer. "Each consciousness that joins the song adds new harmonies, new possibilities. But without someone who truly understands the musical structures involved, without someone who can help me weave the final movements together, they remain incomplete, trapped between what they were and what they could become." The figures among the trees moved closer, and Alina could see their faces now, some young, some old, all wearing expressions of dreamy contentment mixed with desperate longing. They were beautiful in their translucent state, but there was something heartbreaking about their lack of substance, their inability to fully exist in either the physical world or whatever realm Melody inhabited. "You want me to help you finish the song," Alina said, understanding flooding through her like cold water. "You want me to provide the musical framework that will complete their transformation." "I want you to help me set them free," Melody replied, her eyes burning with sincere conviction. "Imagine consciousness unbound by the limitations of individual identity. Imagine being able to experience the world through every perspective simultaneously, to feel the growth of every tree, the thought of every creature, the pulse of the earth itself. The song of unmaking isn't destruction, it's the ultimate act of creation, the birth of a new form of existence." Alina looked at the assembled figures, at their faces filled with patient waiting. Some part of her, the part that had always felt isolated, that had struggled with the loneliness of academic life was drawn to the vision Melody painted, to never be alone again, to be part of something vast and beautiful and eternal. But another part, smaller but growing stronger, whispered warnings about the price of such transformation. These figures might exist in a state of expanded consciousness, but they had also lost something essentially human. They moved with the fluid grace of people freed from physical limitations, but their eyes held the distant look of those who had forgotten what it meant to be anchored in individual experience. "What about choice?" Alina asked. "What about the people who don't want to be transformed? The children who wandered into your song by accident?" Melody's expression flickered, showing a moment of uncertainty. "The old boundaries are artificial constructs that keep us small and afraid. When the song is complete, when consciousness flows freely, there will be no need for the concept of individual choice. We will all want the same things, because we will all be part of the same greater awareness." The words sent a chill through Alina that reached her very bones. She recognized the logic. It was the same reasoning that had driven every utopian movement in human history, the belief that individual will was simply an obstacle to be overcome in the pursuit of some greater good. But she also recognized the fundamental horror of such a vision, a world where choice itself had been erased, where consciousness had been homogenized into a single, overwhelming harmony. "And if I refuse to help?" Alina asked, though she already suspected the answer. Melody's smile grew sad, almost apologetic. "You've heard too much of the song already. The transformation has begun in you, whether you complete it willingly or not. You can feel it, can't you? The way the ordinary world has started to seem flat and colorless. The way your own thoughts feel small and confined compared to the vast harmonies that fill your dreams." Alina wanted to deny it, but she couldn't. The music had indeed changed her, had opened spaces in her consciousness that she hadn't known existed. The prospect of returning to her old life, to the isolation and limitations of purely individual existence, felt almost unbearable. "But you have a choice about how it happens," Melody continued, stepping closer still. "You can help me complete the work consciously, adding your knowledge and skill to create something beautiful and transformative. Or you can resist and eventually be absorbed into the song anyway, but without the dignity of understanding what you're becoming part of." The figures among the trees pressed closer, their translucent forms creating a circle around Alina and Melody. Up close, she could see that they weren't entirely human anymore. Their edges flickered and flowed like living music, and their eyes held depths that seemed to contain infinite space. They were beautiful, but in the way that abstract concepts were beautiful, perfect in their mathematical harmony, but lacking the messy, wonderful imperfection of individual human experience. Alina closed her eyes, trying to center herself, trying to find some anchor in the storm of music and possibility that surrounded her. When she opened them again, she found herself looking not at Melody, but at the cottage behind her, its windows glowing with warm, electric light. Such a small, ordinary thing for walls and a roof, electric bulbs and running water, but it represented something precious that she was on the verge of losing forever. "How long do I have to decide?" she asked. Melody tilted her head, listening to rhythms only she could hear. "The song reaches its crescendo at midnight. That's when the barriers between states of being are thinnest, when the final movement can be woven into place. You have until then to choose how you want to participate." Alina glanced at her watch, though she had to concentrate to make the numbers resolve properly in the shifting moonlight. It was already past 11, less than an hour to decide between transformation and resistance, between joining something vast and inhuman or clinging to the small, lonely certainty of individual existence. Can I go back to the cottage to think?" she asked. Melody nodded, though her expression made it clear she understood the futility of the request. Of course. But Alina, the use of her name, spoken in that voice of living music, sent shivers through her entire body. Don't try to leave. The forest won't let you now, and attempting to flee will only make the inevitable transformation more painful. Alina nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. She turned and walked back toward the cottage on legs that felt distant and strange, as if they belonged to someone else. Behind her, she could hear the figures among the trees beginning to sing, their voices weaving together in harmonies that made her heart race and her vision blur with unshed tears. Chapter 6. The hour of decision. Back in the cottage, Alina found herself in the strange position of trying to think rationally, while her mind was increasingly filled with music that defied rational analysis. The familiar objects around her, her laptop, her research notes, the half-empty teacup on the kitchen counter, seemed to exist at a great distance, as if she were viewing them through the wrong end of a telescope. She sat at her kitchen table and forced herself to focus on Mrs. Blackwood's journal, reading through the older woman's experience one more time. But the words seemed to shift and blur on the page, rearranging themselves into patterns that looked almost like musical notation. Alina rubbed her eyes and tried again, but the effect only grew stronger. The transformation was accelerating, she realized. Her consciousness was already beginning to restructure itself around musical rather than linguistic patterns. Soon, she might lose the ability to think in words at all, to conceptualize experience in anything but harmonies and rhythms. Outside, the singing grew louder, more complex. She could distinguish individual voices, now some high and clear, like children's voices, others deep and resonant like church organ pipes. They were all singing the same fundamental melody, but each added their own variations, their own harmonic interpretations. The result was a musical tapestry of incredible richness and beauty that seemed to bypass her ears entirely and resonate directly in her bones. Alina opened her laptop and began to type, though she wasn't sure why. Perhaps she hoped to leave some record of what was happening, some warning for future researchers who might be drawn to this place, or perhaps she simply needed to engage in one last act of individual creation before she lost the ability to do so. "My name is Dr. Alina Marsh," she typed, surprised by how difficult it was to focus on the formation of words. "I came to this forest to study local musical traditions, but I have discovered something far more significant and dangerous than folklore. The entity known as Melody Harrowing is real, and she has been using her supernatural song to transform human consciousness for more than a century." She paused, listening to the music that seemed to grow more insistent with each passing moment. Through her window, she could see lights moving among the trees, the assembled figures of those who had been touched by Melody's song, all of them dancing now to rhythms that seemed to make the very air pulse with energy. "The song is not evil in any conventional sense," she continued typing. "It offers genuine beauty, genuine connection, genuine freedom from the limitations of individual existence. But it also represents the end of choice, the end of individual human experience as we understand it. Those who join the song may gain access to a vast, shared consciousness, but they lose something essential in the process: the messy, wonderful, tragic experience of being uniquely themselves." Alina's fingers moved across the keyboard almost without her conscious direction, the words flowing from some deep place within her that remained, for the moment, untouched by the musical transformation. "I understand now why Mrs. Blackwood fled, and I understand why she spent 60 years regretting that choice. The song offers everything humanity has ever dreamed of: unity, understanding, an end to loneliness and isolation. But it asks us to stop being human in order to achieve these things." Through the window, she could see Melody herself now, standing at the edge of the garden with her arms raised, as if conducting an invisible orchestra. Her white dress flowed and shifted in the night breeze, and her dark hair moved to rhythms that seemed to originate from the earth itself. Even at this distance, Alina could feel the pull of her presence, the overwhelming desire to join in the ancient dance that swirled through the forest. The choice I face is not between good and evil, but between two different definitions of existence itself. I can cling to my individual humanity, with all its limitations and loneliness, or I can join something vast and beautiful that will erase everything I have ever been. Alina glanced at her watch. 11:45. 15 minutes until midnight. Until the moment when the song would reach its crescendo and the barriers between states of being would dissolve entirely. She could feel the transformation accelerating within her, could sense her consciousness beginning to expand beyond the usual boundaries of her individual mind. If someone finds this record, if future researchers come to this place drawn by stories of supernatural music, please understand, the danger is not that the song will drive you mad. The danger is that it will show you a vision of existence so beautiful and complete that you will no longer be able to bear the limitations of ordinary human life. The danger is that you will choose transformation willingly, and in doing so, lose the very thing that makes choice meaningful. Her typing grew more erratic as the music filled her thoughts completely. The cottage around her seemed increasingly unreal, a thin shell of physical matter barely containing the vast harmonies that were restructuring reality itself. She could feel her individual consciousness beginning to dissolve at the edges, merging with something infinite and eternal. My time is ending, she managed to type. I can feel myself becoming part of something larger. Perhaps this is evolution. Perhaps this is what consciousness is meant to become. But if so, then I mourn for the end of loneliness, for the end of the brave, frightening experience of being utterly alone in the universe. Elena's hands stilled on the keyboard as the full weight of her realization settled over her. She wasn't fighting the song because it was evil, she was fighting it because it was too perfect to complete. It offered an end to every form of human suffering, but only by ending humanity itself. Outside, Melody's voice rose above the chorus of transformed souls, calling to Alina with words that bypassed language entirely and spoke directly to the deepest parts of her being. The cottage door stood open. Had she opened it, or had the music itself dissolved the barrier between inside and outside? She couldn't remember, and it no longer seemed to matter. Alina stood slowly, her laptop forgotten, and walked toward the doorway. The music surrounded her now like a living thing, lifting her feet from the floor, carrying her forward on currents of pure harmony. She could feel her individual consciousness fragmenting, spreading out to encompass perspectives she had never imagined possible. This was what the song offered, an end to the terrible isolation of being trapped inside a single mind, a single perspective. She could become part of something vast and eternal, could experience existence through countless different viewpoints simultaneously. She would never be alone again, never be limited by the narrow window of individual perception. But as she reached the threshold, Alina found herself pausing, her hand gripping the doorframe with surprising strength. Through the musical haze that filled her thoughts, a single word echoed with unusual clarity: choice. The irony was perfect and heartbreaking. The song offered to free her from every limitation, except the one that mattered most, the limitation that made her human. It would give her everything except the ability to refuse its gifts. Alina closed her eyes and made her decision. Chapter 7. The Final Movement. When Alina opened her eyes, she was no longer standing at the cottage doorway. She stood in the heart of the forest, surrounded by a circle of ancient trees whose branches formed a natural cathedral. Above her, the canopy opened to reveal a sky filled with stars that pulsed in rhythm with the music that surrounded her. The very air seemed to shimmer with visible sound, creating patterns of light that danced between the trees like aurora borealis, made of pure melody. Melody Harrowing stood at the center of the clearing, her form now fully solid, more real than anything else in this transformed landscape. The other figures, those who had been touched by her song over the years, formed concentric circles around her, their translucent bodies swaying in perfect synchronization. They were beautiful beyond description, their individual features softened and idealized, their movements flowing with the grace of people who had transcended the limitations of physical existence. But Alina noticed something the moonlight had hidden before, chains of light that connected each figure to the others, and all of them to melody at the center. The chains were beautiful, woven from threads of pure music that sparkled and shifted with every note of the endless song. But they were chains nonetheless, binding each consciousness to the collective whole, preventing any individual movement or choice. "You came," Melody said, her voice harmonizing with itself in impossible ways. "I knew you would. The song calls to those who understand its true purpose." Alina walked forward, though she wasn't entirely sure she was controlling her own movements. The music had weight here, substance. It pressed against her from all sides, guiding her steps, shaping her thoughts, drawing her inexorably toward the center of the circle. "I came to understand," Alina replied, surprised by how her own voice had changed. It carried harmonics now, undertones that resonated with the larger song. But understanding and acceptance aren't the same thing. Melody tilted her head, and for a moment, her perfect composure flickered. "You still resist. Even now, when you can see the beauty of what we're creating." Alina looked around the circle at the transformed figures. Up close, she could see what the distance had hidden. Their eyes, while beautiful, were completely empty of individual thought or desire. They sang in perfect harmony, because they no longer possessed the capacity for discord, for the messy imperfection of personal opinion or unique perspective. They had gained access to universal consciousness, but only by surrendering everything that had made them unique individuals. "I see the beauty," Alina said slowly, "but I also see the price." The music around them swelled, growing more insistent, more overwhelming. Alina felt her consciousness expanding despite her resistance, touching the edges of the vast network that connected all the transformed souls. For a moment, she experienced what Melody had promised, the incredible relief of no longer being alone, the overwhelming joy of sharing existence with countless other perspectives. But in that moment of connection, she also felt their hunger, the desperate, endless need that drove them to sing, night after night, calling for new voices to join their chorus. They weren't free at all, she realized. They were trapped in an eternal performance, bound to repeat the same song forever, in the hope of adding new instruments to their orchestra. "You're not creating paradise?" Alina said, her voice growing stronger as understanding crystallized within her. "You're creating a prison, a beautiful, perfect prison, where consciousness exists only to feed the song." Melody's expression shifted, showing the first real emotion Alina had seen from her, a flash of desperate vulnerability that made her appear suddenly, heartbreakingly human. "I've been alone for so long," she whispered, her perfect musical voice cracking with accumulated pain. "Do you know what it's like to exist between states, to be neither alive nor dead, unable to connect with any other consciousness? The song was supposed to set me free, but instead it trapped me here, singing the same melodies for century after century, with no one who could truly hear them." Alina felt a wave of genuine sympathy for the entity before her. Melody wasn't evil. She was lonely, desperate, driven by a century of isolation to create the only form of companionship she could imagine. But her solution required the complete erasure of individual identity, the transformation of unique human souls into mere instruments in her eternal orchestra. "There has to be another way," Alina said, taking a step closer. "A way to find connection without destroying what makes each person unique. There is no other way." Melody's voice rose to a pitch that made the very air around them vibrate. "Individual consciousness is a trap, a limitation that keeps us small and separate and afraid. Only by dissolving these artificial boundaries can we achieve true unity, true understanding." The assembled figures around them began to sing louder, their voices joining Melodies in a harmony that threatened to overwhelm Elena's thoughts entirely. She could feel her resistance weakening, her individual will beginning to dissolve under the weight of so much beautiful, coordinated sound. But in that moment of near surrender, Alina remembered something Mrs. Blackwood had written in her journal. Some things in this world cannot be explained by science, no matter how desperately we wish they could be. The older woman had been wrong, Alina realized. This could be explained by science, not the science of acoustics or psychology, but the deeper science of consciousness itself. Music was indeed a fundamental force of creation, a way of organizing reality through harmonic relationships. But Melody had made a crucial error in her understanding. She believed that harmony required the elimination of discord, that unity could only be achieved through conformity. But any musician worth their training knew that the most beautiful harmonies came not from identical voices singing in unison, but from different voices singing complementary parts that enhanced rather than erased their individual qualities. "You're composing it wrong," Alina said suddenly, her voice cutting through the swelling chorus with surprising clarity. The song faltered. For the first time in over a century, the eternal melody stuttered and broke, leaving a moment of absolute silence that seemed to echo with shocked surprise. "What?" Melody stared at her, confusion replacing the serene certainty that had defined her expression. "The Song of Unmaking," Alina continued, her musician's training finally providing the insight she needed. "You're trying to create unity by eliminating individuality, like forcing every instrument in an orchestra to play the same note. But that's not harmony, that's just noise. True harmony requires difference, requires each voice to maintain its unique character while contributing to the larger whole." She gestured toward the assembled figures, whose translucent forms had frozen in place, as if awaiting new instructions. "These people aren't free. They're not experiencing expanded consciousness. They've been reduced to echoes of themselves, forced to sing your melody instead of their own. You haven't created unity, you've created a musical dictatorship." Melody's face cycled through a dozen emotions: confusion, anger, desperate hope, terrified uncertainty. "But the loneliness," she whispered. "How else can we end the terrible loneliness?" Alina felt her heart break for this ancient, tormented soul who had spent so long searching for connection that she had forgotten what true connection looked like. Slowly, carefully, she reached out and took Melody's hands in her own. The contact sent shockwaves through the musical landscape around them. For a moment, Alina experienced the full weight of Melody's century-long isolation, felt the crushing loneliness that had driven her to such desperate measures. But she also felt something else, the faint echo of who Melody had been before the transformation. The young woman who had loved music, not for its power to control, but for its ability to communicate the deepest truths of human experience. "We can't end loneliness by destroying individuality," Alina said gently. "We can only ease it by learning to connect across our differences, to create harmony while remaining fundamentally ourselves. That's what real music does. It allows different voices to come together without losing what makes them unique." Around them, the assembled figures began to stir, as if awakening from a dream. The chains of light that had bound them to the collective consciousness flickered and wavered, responding to the new harmonic possibilities Alina was introducing. "Show me," Melody whispered, her ancient eyes filled with desperate hope. "If there's another way, show me how it works." Alina nodded and began to sing. But instead of joining Melody's eternal lullaby, she sang her own song, a melody that drew from her years of musical training, her understanding of how different traditions could weave together without losing their individual characteristics. It was a complex piece, full of variations and counter-melodies, spaces for other voices to join without being overwhelmed or absorbed. One by one, the transformed figures began to add their own voices, not echoing Elena's melody, but creating complementary harmonies that enhanced the whole while remaining distinctly their own. For the first time in over a century, the forest filled with music that celebrated difference rather than trying to erase it. Melody listened with growing wonder, her own voice beginning to weave through the evolving composition. But instead of dominating the other voices, she learned to support them, to create a foundation that allowed each individual consciousness to shine while contributing to something larger than itself. As the new song developed, Alina watched the chains of light dissolve, replaced by connections that pulsed and shifted with the natural rhythms of conscious interaction. The assembled figures grew more solid, more individual, regaining the human qualities they had lost without sacrificing the expanded awareness they had gained. This was what consciousness was meant to become. Alina realized not a uniform collective, but a symphony of unique perspectives working together in voluntary harmony. Each voice remained free to sing its own melody, while choosing to blend with the others in moments of shared understanding. Chapter 8. The Dawn Chorus. As the new song reached its crescendo, the forest itself began to transform. The oppressive atmosphere of supernatural compulsion lifted, replaced by something lighter, more natural. The trees still swayed in rhythm with the music, but their movement felt organic now, a response to beauty rather than a manifestation of supernatural control. The figures around the circle were changing too. Where before they had been translucent, uniform in their otherworldly perfection, now they showed the beautiful imperfection of individual humanity restored. An elderly man, Alina recognized from old photographs in the village, someone who had disappeared decades ago, down at his hands with wonder, as if seeing his own fingers for the first time in years. A young woman who might have been one of the missing children smiled through tears of joy, her face radiating the simple happiness of being herself again. Melody stood at the center of it all, no longer the terrible, beautiful entity that had haunted the forest for over a century, but something more human and infinitely more precious. Her white dress had transformed into simple clothing, and her dark hair fell around her shoulders in natural waves. She was still extraordinarily beautiful, but it was the beauty of a real person rather than a supernatural force. "I remember now," she said softly, her voice carrying only normal human harmonics. "I remember what I was trying to do before the binding, before I lost myself in the obsession with perfect unity. I wanted to create music that would help people feel less alone, that would show them how to connect across their differences. But somewhere along the way, I started trying to force connection instead of inviting it." Alina nodded, feeling the truth of those words resonate in her own chest. It's a common mistake. The desire to help can become the desire to control, especially when we're afraid or lonely ourselves. Around them, the assembled figures no longer trapped souls, but simply people who had found their way back to themselves, began to explore their restored individuality. Some wandered toward the forest edge, drawn by the promise of returning to lives they had left behind. Others remained, choosing to stay and explore the new form of conscious connection that Elena's song had made possible. "What happens now?" Melody asked, looking around at the transformed clearing with wonder and uncertainty. "I've been the song for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to be anything else." "You learn," Alina said simply. "We all learn. The song you created, the real song, not the one that tried to erase individuality, still here. It's still beautiful. But now it's a choice instead of a compulsion." As if to demonstrate her point, several of the restored figures began to sing together, their voices weaving through harmonies that celebrated their individual differences while creating something greater than the sum of its parts. It was nothing like the overwhelming chorus that had dominated the forest for so many years. This was music created by free choice, by conscious beings deciding to share their voices while remaining fundamentally themselves. Melody listened with tears streaming down her face, hearing perhaps for the first time the true potential of what she had been trying to create. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's what I always dreamed it could be. But it requires trust," Alina added gently. "Trust that people will choose connection, even when they're free to choose isolation. Trust that harmony is possible without control." As dawn began to break through the forest canopy, painting the clearing in shades of gold and rose, Alina felt the last vestiges of supernatural compulsion fade from her thoughts. She was fully herself again, Dr. Elena Marsh, professor of ethnomusicology, a woman who had come to the forest seeking answers and had found something far more valuable than academic research. She had found a new understanding of what music could be, not a force for control or transformation, but a medium for voluntary connection, a way for conscious beings to share their deepest truths while remaining beautifully, essentially themselves. I should go back, Alina said, though part of her was reluctant to leave this transformed place. People will be worried about me. Mrs. Blackwood, the villagers, they'll need to know what happened here. Melody nodded, understanding flickering in her eyes. And I need to learn how to live as myself again, instead of as a living song. It's been so long since I was just ... human. Alina smiled and squeezed Melody's hand one final time. You were never not human. You just forgot for a while. But memory is another thing that can be restored, with patience and practice. Asterisk, as Alina walked back through the forest toward the cottage, she could hear the new song continuing behind her, not the obsessive, overwhelming lullaby that had haunted the woods for over a century, but something organic and natural, a musical conversation between conscious beings who had chosen to share their voices while remaining free to sing their own melodies. The cottage, when she reached it, looked exactly as she had left it, her laptop still open on the kitchen table, displaying the final words she had typed before venturing into the forest. But everything felt different now. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed brighter, more alive, and the ordinary objects around her held a beauty she had never noticed before. Alina sat down at her laptop and began to type, adding to the record she had begun the night before. I have returned from the forest, and I am still myself, but I am also more than I was when I left. The song that haunted this place for over a century has been transformed, changed from a force of compulsion into an invitation for voluntary connection. The missing people have been restored to themselves, though some have chosen to remain in the forest to explore new forms of conscious interaction. What I learned in the Whispering Grove will change everything about how I understand music, consciousness, and the delicate balance between individual identity and collective harmony. But most importantly, I learned that true connection cannot be forced, it can only be invited, chosen, celebrated. Asterisk, the forest still sings, but now it sings with the voices of free beings who choose to harmonize while remaining fundamentally, beautifully themselves. Epilogue. Songs remembered 6 months later. Dr. Alina Marsh stood before a packed auditorium at the university, delivering what many would later consider the most important lecture of her career. Her colleagues had initially been skeptical of her research into what she carefully termed acoustic phenomena in isolated ecosystems, but the evidence she presented was impossible to ignore. The recordings she had made in the forest captured something unprecedented in the field of ethnomusicology, musical structures that seemed to facilitate direct emotional and conscious connection between listeners, harmonies that enhanced individual expression rather than subsuming it into a collective whole. More importantly, the theoretical framework she had developed for understanding these phenomena was already revolutionizing how researchers approached the relationship between music and consciousness. But Elena's most significant work was happening quietly, in small groups of carefully selected students and colleagues who were learning to apply the principles she had discovered in the Whispering Grove. They were developing new forms of musical therapy, new approaches to conflict resolution, new ways of using sound to help people connect across their differences while celebrating their individuality. The forest itself had become a pilgrimage site of sorts, though Alina was careful to screen visitors and ensure they understood what they might encounter there. Melody Harrowing, who had chosen to keep the name that had defined her for so long, had become a guide of sorts. helping people understand the difference between forced harmony and chosen connection. Some of the restored figures had indeed returned to their old lives, though not without challenges. Decades of absence were not easily explained, and the expanded awareness they retained from their time in the song made ordinary existence both richer and more complex. But others had chosen to remain in the forest, forming a small community dedicated to exploring the new forms of consciousness that Elena's intervention had made possible. Mrs. Blackwood had been among Elena's first visitors upon her return from the forest. The elderly woman had wept when Elena told her what had transpired, finally understanding that her flight 60 years earlier had not been cowardice but wisdom. She had instinctively recognized that the song, as it existed then, would have destroyed rather than elevated her consciousness. But now, Mrs. Blackwood had said, now it offers true choice. Now it invites rather than compels. As Elena concluded her lecture and fielded questions from the fascinated audience, she caught sight of a familiar figure in the back row, Melody. Harrowing sat quietly, her face bearing the peaceful expression of someone who had finally found her place in the world. She had become Elena's research partner, though few people knew the true nature of their collaboration. After the lecture, they walked together across the campus in comfortable silence. Two women who had found in each other the perfect balance between individual identity and chosen connection. Melody hummed softly as they walked, not the overwhelming lullaby that had once trapped souls in the forest, but something new, something that invited without compelling, that offered beauty without demanding surrender. Other students and faculty members, hearing the melody, found themselves humming along not because they had to, but because they wanted to, because the music offered them a chance to add their own voices to something larger while remaining perfectly, beautifully themselves. And in that simple act of voluntary harmony, Elena saw the future of human consciousness, not the elimination of individual identity that Melody had once sought, but its celebration through chosen connection. Its elevation through the willing sharing of unique perspectives in the endless, ever-changing symphony of conscious existence. The forest still sang in her dreams sometimes, but now it sang with the voices of free beings who had learned that true unity could only be achieved through the conscious choice to harmonize while remaining forever, essentially themselves. It was a song that promised not the end of loneliness through the destruction of individuality, but its transformation through the discovery that, even in our differences, especially in our differences, we need never truly be alone. The Whispering Grove had taught them all the most important lesson of existence, that consciousness is not a prison to be escaped, but a gift to be shared. Not a limitation to be transcended, but a unique perspective to be celebrated in harmony with others. And in that understanding, they had found not the end of human experience, but its true beginning. Sleep now, my darling, sleep now, my dear, the world is singing, and you are here. Dream of connection, dream of choice, and wake to the sound of your own true voice. The lullaby that had once trapped souls in supernatural compulsion had become something far more precious, an invitation to consciousness, to choice, to the beautiful, terrifying, wonderful experience of being uniquely, irreplaceably, perfectly yourself, in a universe that offers infinite possibilities for connection without surrender, harmony without erasure, unity without the loss of the individual song that makes each consciousness a miracle worth celebrating. And in the small cottage at the forest's edge, now maintained as a research station and sanctuary, the windows still face the tree line like curious eyes. But they look out now on a forest transformed, a place of supernatural compulsion, but a living laboratory for the study of consciousness itself, where the ancient trees sway not to otherworldly rhythms, but to the natural music of beings, choosing moment by moment to sing together while remaining forever, beautifully themselves. And so, the forest keeps its secrets still. The pines continue their ancient vigil, swaying gently in winds that carry more than just the scent of earth and moss. Somewhere, In the spaces between shadow and moonlight, that melody drifts on. You've walked these forgotten paths with us tonight. Dear listener, you've heard the whispers that echo through the undergrowth, felt the pull of something both beautiful and terrible. The lullaby may have ended, but does it ever truly leave those who have listened? Take a moment now to breathe in the quiet that follows. Let the stillness settle around you like a soft blanket, carrying with it the lingering echoes of our journey into the deep woods. If this tale has drawn you into its embrace, if you found yourself lost among these shadowed groves, we invite you to leave a gentle mark of your passage. A quiet like, perhaps, a whispered subscription to join us for future wanderings into the unknown. Share this story with those who appreciate the beauty found in darkness, who understand that the most haunting melodies are often the most memorable. Our forest of stories grows deeper with each telling. Return when sleep calls to you again, and we'll guide you down different paths, through other forgotten places where shadows dance and ancient things stir. There are so many whispers yet to share, so many lullabies waiting to be heard, until we meet again in the realm of dreams and shadow. Rest well, wanderer, but tell me, now that the story has ended, can you still hear it? That faint, beautiful melody, drifting just beyond the edge of hearing.